Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Emily DuVal, whose DuVal lab at the Florida State University studies behavioral ecology, population genetics, and the role of sexual selection in speciation. In this episode, we talk to this much-feted, much-cited professor about topics that would seem like a divorce lawyer's nightmare. Multiple paternity, non-optimal choice of mate, alpha and beta mates, and the adaptive basis of female mate choice. More specifically, we're going to talk about one of my dream birds, the Manakin of Panama, the lance-tailed manakin in particular, whose spectacular breeding display makes time fly when you watch it on YouTube. Welcome, Dr. DuVal, or if I may call you Emily.
Yes, please do. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Maybe we can start by, if you can tell us about your work for a lay audience.
Sure. I study cooperation and mate choice in wild birds. And I'm especially interested in how complex social behavior evolves. So I study that in birds because they're observable, they're active during the day, and you can sit quietly in the bushes and watch them behave naturally. And also because they do a lot of really spectacular things. So really beautiful and complicated displays, but also social interactions that spread out actually over decades of lifetime. And I really love trying to uncover some of the puzzles that come from that.
What are the different types of things, breeding behavior in birds, for example, that you study?
Well, so I'm interested in kind of a niche type of breeding behavior in birds, but in general, breeding behavior in birds covers everything you can pretty much think of. The majority of birds mate monogamously, so they're socially with one male and one female together raising a brood. But within that, there's a lot of variation. And while social monogamy is really common, genetic monogamy is actually really rare. So most birds that have one social partner sometimes mate with other individuals. And in any one nest of birds, there are multiple fathers represented pretty commonly. And so the type of birds that I study are interesting because they involve cooperation in their mate choice and courtship. So lance-tailed manakins are my main study species, and they're, as you said, just absolutely fascinating because males form long-term alliances and then perform cooperative courtship displays. So their display involves leaping back and forth over one another and coordinating back and forth flights. There's also a duet song component that occurs way before females are around. But they do this leapfrog dance right in the female's face as she's making her mate choices. And as you say, you can watch it for as long as they'll do it. It's just absolutely fascinating. But the male alliances can last for up to 6 years, where there's one alpha male and one beta male. And the beta male usually doesn't copulate while he's a beta male. He only participates in these displays that seem to help the alpha copulate. And so I got interested in the species from the perspective of why the subordinate males in these partnerships are participating. But from there, I've kind of laid a foundation in the population that I study of knowing who's who, how old they are, what all their relationships are. And it's let me ask questions that I really didn't anticipate when I was starting the project about what the females are doing and what the benefits of this sort of interaction is for the alpha males as well.
So to ask the follow-up, what is the benefit for the subordinate male, the beta male, in this whole thing?
And I've only been studying them for 23 years, so I can't give you a definitive answer. But we do know that the alpha and beta males are not close relatives. So one of the major ideas about why animals would ever cooperate is that they could be helping a relative and passing on their genes indirectly. And that's absolutely not the case here. The beta males are no more related than a random pick from the population to the alphas that they participate with. We also know that beta males really don't get to breed very much while they're beta males. So they do sire some chicks, which could be really important. They sire about 3% of all the chicks that we figured out who the fathers are. But what they do quite reliably is increase their chances of eventually becoming alpha by being a beta. And so they aren't just inheriting the display sites where they help out. If you remove alpha males, the beta males frequently move to be someplace else. They're not just waiting in line. But the males that are betas are statistically more likely to make it to alpha status than males who don't serve as beta males. So that is a huge benefit to this sort of long-term social interaction. And but on a male-to-male basis, there's also a lot of variation in how they move up through the population. We have also found that some males just completely skip the beta step and go straight to being alpha. And so being an alpha or being a beta is helpful to becoming an alpha, but it's not the only way to do things. And so some of our current research is focused on what maintains variability in this complicated interaction, and how sort of what stabilizes it in general.
A lay person question. Earlier, you talked about how genetically it can be variable in a nest. So does that mean that each egg could come from a different father? Is that what that means?
Yeah. So in a bird nesting in your yard, there might be 5 eggs, and 2 of them could be from one dad, and 3 could be from the father who's attending the nest. And so in socially monogamous birds, the thinking about what's going on there has largely focused on restrictions in what females can do. So they might be picking one mate because he has a really wonderful territory and a great spot to put a nest. But for some reason, she really wanted to actually have offspring with another male. And so it's a way to have the best of both worlds. But in lance-tailed manakins, the females only lay 2 eggs in a nest, and the males don't have anything to do with nests or the places that females put their nests, or they pretty much never see their offspring. And so it's really fascinating that we've found that even within these 2 egg nests, about 14% of the time, they're 2 different dads. And it challenges some of the hypotheses about why females mate multiply, because female lance-tailed manakins aren't restricted in who they can mate with. It's not that they're bargaining with males for different sorts of things. The only thing they get from males are sperm, but sometimes they apparently choose to get sperm from 2 different males.
How did you come to study lance-tailed manakins?
Well, I was really fascinated with cooperation, and cooperation in all of its dimensions. In the bird world, there's been a lot of research on cooperative breeding behavior, where young from one year stick around instead of dispersing and help raise the offspring in the next nest, usually in their parents' nest. And a lot of the thinking about why they do this has focused on relatedness, that they're helping raise their own half siblings or their own siblings that are just younger. And so at a time in life when they couldn't breed themselves, they're still spreading more of their genes into the world by helping raise these offspring that are their parents' offspring, so non-descendant kin. And I really I believe that was the major explanation for this sort of complex cooperative behavior. And when I was an undergraduate, I read some of the really phenomenal work by Dave McDonald, and he studied long-tailed manakins in Costa Rica at the time. And he found that males that also have these cooperative pairs, like in lance-tailed manakins, the males in these partnerships were not close relatives. And it was one of the first genetic studies of that sort of social interaction that was ever published. And I was skeptical. You should be skeptical. And I was sure that it was wrong. No offense, Dave. and so for my PhD, I wanted to test these ideas about cooperation in a different context than cooperative breeding. It didn't seem fair that everybody ends up related. And so it didn't seem like a fair test of the ideas about cooperative breeding, because by default, you're more likely to encounter close relatives when you're helping at the nest. It seemed to me that if cooperation was really driven by these relatedness interactions, then a situation like the lance-tailed manakins, where the relatives would have to seek each other out and really make an effort, if relatedness was driving those interactions as well, I thought that would be really strong evidence that it supported these complex cooperative interactions. And so that was a long way to say that I was skeptical about some of the results that I read that were really exciting in the literature, and I wanted to have a novel test of how how relatedness might stabilize cooperative interactions. And so I launched out studying a bird that there really hadn't been any behavioral work on before, and collected blood samples from the males in the population, put color bands on the birds so that I could track them and keep track of who's who over time, and did a lot of nest searching to find chicks and collect blood samples from them as well. And then I was able to figure out who actually was the dad and the mom of these chicks. And what I found was that Dave McDonald's work was absolutely right, that these cooperative pairs are not close relatives at all, and that there's something different, and I would argue a lot more interesting going on.
Because for us, cooperating to compete seems like a contradiction, because but you're saying that's what alpha and beta males do.
Yeah, it seems so. So it seemed like a contradiction to me as well, which is why I've been so fascinated with these birds for so long. But it seems like these alliances are a key way that males maintain their display areas and attract females. But that it's not as simple as having a male with you on a day-to-day basis increases your success. These males are interacting over a really long timeline. The longest partnerships we've seen are around 6 years. And so the benefits of having a beta around seem to change across an alpha's lifetime. And likewise, the benefits of being a beta probably change across a beta's lifetime as well. So it's even more complicated than we thought it was to start with.
Not all the betas serve the alphas, do they? Or they do?
So the beta role is defined by having this alliance with an alpha. There are a lot of adult males who are not betas or alphas. They're in the population that I study, there are around 150 adult males every year, and only about 30 of them are alphas and around 30 betas. And everybody else is there and interacting. Some of them form alliances with males, some of them move around quite extensively. I think they are also doing really interesting things, but they're harder to observe because they're not in such reliable locations. One of the features of a lek is that males are reliably in one location over time, which makes it a lot easier to track who they're interacting with and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Can you talk about lekking species and an exploded lek, all of those kind of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So lek comes from the Swedish word meaning to play, and that reflects what people first thought when they were observing these the behaviors of lekking males. So a lek is a mating system that's an aggregation of males that hang around usually in one location, and females visit this group of males to choose a mate. But they only visit for sperm. So they're not getting any food or resources that they couldn't get someplace else. And they nest away from these males' display areas and don't get any help from males raising their offspring. And so some people say it's kind of the animal equivalent of a singles bar. But So leks have been disproportionately important in thinking about sexual selection, in part because they are really observable. So you can go to one location and see females come in and make mate choices, which provided some insight to which males were successful and which males weren't, even before there was the capacity to measure genetic reproductive success of these individuals. But on top of that, because a small number of males usually monopolizes reproductive success on these leks, so just a few males get all the matings, it means that sexual selection can proceed really rapidly in these situations. So if those males have heritable traits, they're passed on to many, many offspring in just a few years of breeding, and the allele frequencies in the population can change quite quickly and dramatically. And so if females are picking mates based on particular traits, those traits should spread, if they're genetic, should spread rapidly through the population. And evolution by sexual selection could be relatively fast in these lekking situations, which is one of the things that I find really fascinating about it.
Have you studied other species? I know you have, like the white-trumped manakin and the laughing falcon. Can you talk about your other species?
Oh, sure. Well, let's see. So the white-ruffed manakin work was a wonderful study led by Megan Jones, a graduate student of mine who was working in a long-term study population established by Alice Boyle, who's at Kansas State University. And Megan had worked previously with Alice before she started graduate school, and then she spun off an independent research direction, understanding how males varied in their cooperative interactions in a different manakin species that also has male-male interactions, but they're more variable than in lance-tailed manakins. So these cooperative interactions are variable in lance-tailed manakins, but in Corapipo altera, this white-ruffed manakin, there's even more variation, and the multi-male interactions are more rare than in lance-tailed manakins. And so what I really love about that work is that Megan dug deeply to think about whether this really was cooperation or not, and to rigorously define what these birds were doing and how these interactions kind of changed the landscape for male reproductive success. So just doing something together isn't enough to make it a cooperative interaction. And so she quantified exactly how often females were truly watching these multi-male displays, and whether within these partnerships, one male was responsible for the copulations, or whether males were just sharing a log and sharing the females that they attract as well. And so the punchline is that there's a lot of variability in these displays, and that across manakin species, there's sort of a continuum of cooperative interactions that's also a really fascinating component of what's going on.
And what about the laughing falcon? That also you mentioned.
Yeah, so the very first paper I ever wrote was a natural history note on laughing falcons. So as I was collecting data for my PhD, I was spending all my time in the forests of Panama, and my field assistants and I had the great luck to see a laughing falcon eating a coral snake twice, actually. And both times we documented it at a level that hadn't been done before. And that was, just out of curiosity. Honestly, when we were starting, we would take notes on everything, of course, and it was really fascinating behavior to see. Laughing falcons are a small raptor that specialize on eating snakes, and they apparently particularly like coral snakes. So in the area where we work, the coral snakes are extremely venomous, and it should be a very dangerous prey item. But they do just fine, and exactly how they manage these snakes to avoid envenomation is interesting. And so in one case, we saw that the falcon had decapitated the snake, and it was draped over a branch dripping blood. And in the other case, we observed it eating the snake with its head still on, kind of starting at the tail end of the snake going forward. And so I've actually published that note because of interactions with colleagues who are really interested in laughing falcons in general, and they needed to cite more information, basically needed a published source for this type of information about background of how these falcons were interacting with snakes. And so that discussion with colleagues was the impetus to sit down and really formally write that up. But it also kind of plays into a larger value that I have for research, which is I feel really privileged to be able to spend so much of my life sitting in the forest. That's what I love to do. And when I do that, I see unexpected stuff all the time. And so I try to keep up on writing these sorts of short little natural history notes that are honestly sometimes the sorts of things that you would find in a journal from the 1960s, but documenting rigorously the kind of interesting things you see in nature, I think is a responsibility of a field biologist. And I like writing these little notes as well as larger papers.
So to talk about the venom of the snake in the laughing falcon, so you said they do it in two ways. One was draping it over the branch, so that I guess presumably, how does that take away the venom in both kinds? One is eating from the tail, and the other is over the branch.
Yeah, and so that's where, as a natural history note, it's not a systematic investigation of how that happened, but instead opportunistic documentation of wow, look at this, the sorts of interesting things that we see. So previously there had been descriptions of laughing falcons decapitating snakes. So they would pin down the snake and bite off their head and then let it quit twitching before they ate it. And that's not what we saw with at least one of those observations. So part of the interesting detail that we got from writing up that note was that there is variation in how these birds are handling the snakes.
Emily, you've also worked with nuthatches, have you?
Yes. So I currently am at Florida State University, and just north of here, there is a research station called Tall Timbers. It's called, let me start that over. So I'm currently at Florida State University, and just north of here, Tall Timbers Research Station is a wonderful tract of longleaf pine forest where vertebrate biologist Jim Cox has been monitoring brown-headed nuthatches for over a decade. And they are a really fascinating species that cooperates in a different way than lance-tailed manakins. So when I moved to Florida State University, I was aware of Jim's work and the idea of getting a chance to collaborate with him here in the Tallahassee area was actually really a draw for coming to this university. So the brown-headed nuthatches are cooperative breeders. So like I described earlier, the young from a nest stick around and help raise offspring in subsequent nests. They don't only do that with relatives. So some of them are helping their parents or their mom and a new mate raise offspring, but some of them redirect their helping to unrelated individuals in their area. And so there's a lot of variation in how their cooperative behavior is directed as well. So there's this underlying theme in my work about understanding how individuals make cooperative choices in complex social situations. And so working with Jim, I had the pleasure of taking part in an experiment that would seem like it wouldn't work at all. And it's great credit to Jim's amazing field skill that it did work. So we wanted to investigate how the social contexts in which these birds find themselves change their behavior as they're at the point of making decisions about whether to disperse or cooperate or what. And so to do that, the idea was to change the social context in these wild birds completely by changing the proportion of males and females that were present in the population. And it seems like that shouldn't be possible. But what we did was to cross-foster chicks among nests. So as the nests were being monitored and as chicks were getting bigger, Jim and his field techs would pull a feather from a developing chick and send it for genetic testing overnight and find out whether that individual chick was a male or a female. And then the next day they would cross-foster chicks among big sections of the population, about 20 nuthatch territories each, with a buffer zone in between, so that half the population fledged essentially only males and half the population fledged essentially only females. And then we're very patient people. So the idea was not we weren't particularly interested in what was going on in the year that these chicks were fledging, but in the subsequent years. And so we had to first see whether these manipulations actually change the adult sex ratio. It was possible that the birds could just fly and redistribute themselves so that they would, again, have an even 50-50 sex ratio. But there was limited enough dispersal that within those big male and female sections of the population, we ended up with an overabundance of males and females, respectively. And then we measured how that changed behavior in subsequent years of offspring. And so what we found was that in the male, so in general, in brown-headed nuthatches, males are the ones who cooperate and help raise the offspring. And so in the male plot, there were larger cooperative groups, so more males stuck around to help at any individual nest, and more territories had helpers in general. And in the female plot, we actually had an increased occurrence of female helpers, which is unusual. And so this suggests that that mate limitation. So what we changed was the adult sex ratio, but the implications are that the individuals that were leaving these nests were encountering limitations on who they could partner with to start their own territories. And by experimentally changing that, we showed that that changed the landscape of cooperation for these birds as well. So opportunities were a really important part of what's going on. And we did this experiment over 5 years. So after manipulating it for a few years in one direction, we switched to control for territory variation among these two territories. And the former female plot was now the male plot and vice versa. So we were able to control for environmental factors and environmental quality as a determinant of what affects these cooperative decisions.
You have a fascinating study that seems to suggest that birds are as influenced by their peers, somewhat like it girls in high school. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I admit I had to look up what an it girl was. I guess I'm a little out of it, but but it's not quite the same as that, because the idea of an it girl is that there are basically social influencers, that they're really highly attractive individuals that dominate a social landscape and set trends. And so what we found, so this idea that social situations can change behavior, especially in mate choice contexts, is really fascinating to me. And working with my postdoc, Blake Jones, we wanted to find out just how much of an influence this social information was in mate choice by doing a meta-analysis of other studies. So ideally, to test this idea that individuals copy each other's mate choice, you would do it experimentally. And in lance-tailed manakins, that sort of experiment is just not feasible. But still, from the literature, quite a lot of people have done studies on different taxa, and we wanted to put them all together and find out, on average, what was the general effect for females of seeing someone else choose a mate and then making her own choice. And in the experiments that have done that, the answer is around 3. So females are about 3 times more likely to mate with a male or a male of a particular phenotype if they've seen someone else mate with him. And so that's a lot. Imagine that's a dating app that increased your chances of finding a mate by 3 times. That would be huge. But within that, there are a couple of things that make the effect even stronger. And so having the observer be inexperienced amplifies the effect. The naive females are more likely to use social information. And we found that when this has been measured in the wild experimentally, which is a hard thing to do, but in the few studies that were able to pull that off, the effect was even stronger, which could be because the researchers picked species that tended to do this social behavior, or that the context of the predator presence and things like that might make females more likely to use social information and make a choice faster, for example. But in terms of whether this relates to it girls, so we found that who the females were observing wasn't a big factor that influenced their choices. So it was important that whether the observer had prior information about what it was like to choose a mate. But when she observed older or more experienced females, she wasn't any more likely to copy or not.
Ah, okay, got it. So based on all this research, so Emily, based on all this research about mate choice, what have you understood about females and choice? Because it's a huge investment for a bird.
Yeah, so while my interest in lance-tailed manakins started out to be all about the males, as I was running this long-term study of male alliances and cooperation, I realized that the females were doing a lot of the truly interesting behavior in the population, and that we had the capacity to follow them back to their nests and track them across their lives to see how their mate choices worked out. And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time trying to quantify was just how choosy females are as they're choosing their mates. So so mate choice in general is sort of the combination of female preference. So what traits or characteristics of the males they would like to have, and also choosiness, which is how much time and effort females are willing to put in to find those males with the preferred traits, and also tactics. It matters how females compare males from available mates. So seeing a great male followed by a really not great male might make the great male look even better. And so in one study, we focused on choosiness, this time and effort. Basically, it might not matter what ideal the females are searching for if they're only willing to spend 3 days looking for these males. So to find out how females were moving among males and how much time they were investing in watching the males' displays, we put transmitters on females' backs and receivers underneath male display perches, and then measured for all daylight hours how much time females were spending at any one male's display site. And we put receivers under 12 different males, so not the whole population. It was a big effort to turn those on and off every day and hike through the forests and up and down to get to them. But what we found was that females are indeed choosy. They're visiting on average about 4 males before they're making a mate choice, and they visit the same male many times. Since then, we've added a video component to that monitoring and recorded that one female can visit the same male, I think, up to 22 times before laying a clutch of 2 eggs. So some females spend quite a lot of time checking these males out. But we found that it also mattered who the female was. So younger females in their first season of choosing mates, visited more males and spent less time with each male. And older females, who presumably knew more about who was available in the population, visited fewer males and spent a lot more time on those males' display perches. And so when we did this with radio telemetry, we didn't know what the females were seeing. We just knew that they were present. In general, whenever a female is present, the males tend to display. And so having a female spend 45 minutes with you usually means a big energetic investment from the male. The female might be preening and yawning on the dance perch, but he is pretty much always showing off for her at that point. So there's there is variation.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
There's variation. Please go ahead.
Oh, there's a lot of variation in how females move among males, and some females return to the same male a lot. Other females view males more widely, and trying to understand how that variation among the females affects sexual selection and the choices that males face is one of our current goals.
Thank you. My last 2 questions have to do with the human species. How has ornithology adapted itself to female researchers such as yourself? And your lab is very diverse. So talk a little bit about being a female ornithologist in today's world.
Well, so there are a lot of amazing and inspiring female ornithologists at this point in time. So to some extent, I don't really think of it as ornithology adapting to women. Here we are, and we are doing it. I've benefited immensely from generations of academics before me who kind of paved the way for me to think that this is so natural that there would be a lot of gender diversity in ornithology and in animal behavior. So I acknowledge that, like, my current privileged situation of feeling like, of course, there's about 50-50 sex ratio among professional ornithologists. That comes from a lot of work and difficulty that my colleagues went through before me. And so that is, I know that it wasn't always as easy as it is now, but now ornithology is very much a welcoming discipline for all types of people.
But for somebody who is starting out and wants to start a lab, is there any insight you can offer?
So I've really benefited wonderfully from working with all kinds of smart, motivated, creative people. And so I've built my lab just by seeking those people out and trying to create opportunities for them to do their best work. And I do think that's really an advisor's job, is to create the stepping stones that people need to be their best scientist, as in whatever way that works out. My lab, my graduate students have all been women in a way that I initially thought was random, but after the 6th woman working in my lab, I asked them, like, what's going on here? Why are we not attracting men as well? And I get really a lot of amazing applicants. Am I being biased in my hiring or something like that? And their response was really enlightening to me. While I didn't choose them because they were women, they all said they applied to my lab, at least in part, because I was a woman. And that really underscored to me how representation matters. That we're focusing a lot on getting graduate students who are diverse into biology right now, which is really important, but helping those people through to faculty positions. Again, it's on the radar. Everyone's working on that now, but that's going to be a really important step to changing the climate so that there are more diverse people working in biology in general across the board. So in terms of advice for starting faculty, be yourself, because showing who you are in all your diverse wonder is really important for creating opportunities for people to see themselves in these positions and choose to make choices that let them, again, do their best science. So if they want to be a faculty member, they can do it. People might choose not to, and that's okay as well.
That's great. Thank you. Last question. What are your favorite bird species?
Well, of course, the lance-tailed manakin. Like you said, you can sit and watch them for as long as they will display. And we just finished our 23rd field season studying this same population of lance-tailed manakins. But there are clearly other birds that are fascinating and that I also love to watch. And thinking about what those are, things like American dippers and gray-cowled wood rails. I was realizing there are some common things that make me really like a bird species. And what I love about birds is when I can watch individuals long enough to see what they're doing and kind of get a secret glimpse into their lives that you wouldn't normally see if you were just driving past. So of course I bird from my car like everyone else. If a hawk flies over, I stop what I'm doing and have a look at it. But what I really love doing is watching individuals over time and seeing the richer background to who they are and how they're interacting and how they got to be where they are. So for example, gray-cowled wood rails are a really secretive forest species that walks around in the understory of the field site where we work on Boca Brava. And so you always feel special when you actually see one. But I've also had them walk past me at close range, ignoring the fact that I'm there, and do things like make these low subsonic boom noises that I didn't even know that they could make, and then have fights with each other and chase each other around me. So I guess I sort of love being invisible and watching birds do what they do. And I love watching species that do really interesting things right in front of me.
So for a person like me or any birder who is in a let's say urban location and is interested in the behavior of birds, is there any advice that you would give so that we can't replicate what you do in the field clearly, but maybe we can just sit in one place? Any advice you can give for a birder?
Well,
about
so
behavior?
that for that type of enjoyment of watching animals, really the secret behind it is sitting outside quietly for hours on end. And I admit I don't do that as much in my own backyard here in Tallahassee as I do in Panama. But I could, just being outside, unplugging, putting down your phone, and just watching what's going on around you. There's fascinating stuff everywhere. And so it has to do with taking the time and slowing down and looking at what's going on. And you really can do that anywhere in the world.
Emily DuVal, thank you so much for being part of the Bird
Thank
Podcast.
you for having me. This is great.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening.